Yeah, hi everybody, it's James Griffiths. Welcome back to the channel, and today I thought I would do a topic which came to me because I've recently come into possession of this album, and this was I bought this from a friend of mine a while ago as a batch of records that he was selling. I'll be doing a video on that in due course. This is Stone Roses' Second Coming, their second album, which came out in 1994 on Geffen. And anybody who was around back then will remember just the expectation and the hype that went with this record. The first Stone Roses album had come out quite a few years before, and the band had been having problems coming up with a follow-up, and the first album had been such a massive success and a huge artistic touchstone really for a generation. There was no way this album was ever going to be able to live up to it, and it didn't. And you know, the band had some problems in the studio. I think there was some drugs flying around and interpersonal problems going on, and John Squire, the guitarist and the songwriter, he kind of went off into a bit of a hard rock Led Zeppelin direction. I actually really enjoyed this album when it first came out. I think it starts off really well. I think it does have some great stuff on it, but the problem with it is that it's just not as good as the first album, and that gave me the idea for just a short video about albums that were always destined to be overshadowed by their illustrious predecessor, and I think that is certainly an example of that. And the other record that came to me straight away, because I've just recently done a video on the big Illustrious album by this artist, and it's Tubular Bells by Mike Oldfield. This is not Tubular Bells, this is Hergest Ridge, which was the follow-up album, and this was always destined to be overshadowed by Tubular Bells. Tubular Bells came about really through a series of happy accidents, and it was an outpouring of inspiration, I think, that Mike Oldfield had been welling up in him for a long time, and it all came spilling out. If you want to watch if you want to know about the story of Tubular Bells and how it came to be, I'll link to my video. Hergest Ridge came about really just as a follow-up. You know, Virgin wanted a follow-up. Mike had moved house. He'd bought a house on the Welsh borders near Herefordshire, near this place called Hergest Ridge, or is it Hergest Ridge? Either Hergest or Hergest. And he just looked out of the window one day and, you know, pointed and said, "What's that?" And the guy he was with said, "It's Hergest Ridge." And he said, "Right, I'll make an album about that then." And I don't think Mike Oldfield really ever quite clicked with this project. It's got some wonderful composition in it, really. I'm inclined to agree with Mike Oldfield's assessment of it, which is the mix. The original mix was a bit murky, and I think he always said you had to really turn up your record player really loud in order to be able to hear some of the intricate things that were going on. It was more of a folky and a bit more of a classical piece, really. I think, in theory, I think he thought, in a way, it was more of a rounded piece of work than Tubular Bells had been, because that was quite improvisatory. This was more composed. It did get to number one, but then it was knocked off number one by Tubular Bells going back to number one. So, you know, Tubular Bells was a monster album. It didn't really matter what this album was going to be like, it was always going to be overshadowed. As it is, I think it's a fine album. It does get unfairly overlooked, but that was one that definitely sprung to mind. And then I just, you know, I started to go through my collection and just, you know, find some well-known albums that I could talk about. The next couple of Beatles related, this is one that sprang to mind straight away. You know, Band on the Run had been such a special album, and it was the album for Paul McCartney and Wings where they'd had to pull one out of the bag, really. You know, the band was meant to be going to Lagos to record it, and then two of the band members left. You know, literally the day before. Paul, Linda and Denny Lane went to Lagos, and I think Band on the Run was the result of a very particular chemistry going on, and I think it was to do with some of the cultural atmosphere of the Lagos sessions bled into the tracks. And, you know, Jeff Emerick engineered it, and there was a very particular sound to that record, and of course it was a massive hit and really established or launched McCartney's solo career properly. This album, Venus and Mars, which is the next one to come out, did get some good notices, and to this day you will get people who say that this is a better album than Band on the Run, or people who enjoy it more. I think mainly in North America. I think this album This album is more of a straight-ahead rock album, really. The second to opening track, Rock Show, you know, it's clearly being constructed as a kind of arena rock anthem, and it was an album that was designed to be taken out on the road and toured. And even though I think it's got some fine material on it, I mean, I love it. Obviously, I'm a huge Wings fan. But I think it was always destined to be overshadowed by Band on the Run, and you know, to this day, Band on the Run is known as the classic Wings album, and it's the one that everybody has in their collection, even though they're, you know, perhaps they're not big fans of McCartney. That and Ram, you know, those are the two that tend to get all the plaudits. And Venus and Mars, really, still to this day, is really seen as being an album for, you know, proper Wings fans, Paul McCartney fans. It's not an album that turns up in that many record collections now outside of that fan base. So, staying on the Beatles theme, George Harrison, and this is his second, or if you don't count the albums that he'd released before the Beatles broke up, his second solo album, Living in the Material World. And this is one that was always going to be overshadowed by the absolute monster, huge success of All Things Must Pass, which was, I think, because it was such a huge album physically as well, it was a box set, it was, you know, 3 records, and again, it was a record that had a bit like Tubular Bells. You know, George had been writing the songs for a long time, and it all came spilling out of him. It seemed like a very organic and fruitful period for him. The massive Phil Spector production on that record, you know, some people like it, some people don't, but it was a totally enormous album. And then he delayed a couple of years before coming out with this one. He did the concert for Bangladesh, and some of the ramifications of that tied him up for a long time, and I think he lost a little bit of momentum. This album came out, Living in the Material World. Some people do prefer this album. The songs are maybe a bit more religious, a bit more introverted, more of a puritanical streak to them in terms of his, you know, his Krishna faith and his religious convictions, and it does tend to get overlooked, I think, because maybe the material is not as immediate or not quite as accessible. You know, the album doesn't really have a big, huge commercial song on it, you know, on the magnitude of, say, What Is Life, but it's still got some great stuff on it, and I do think a little bit like Venus and Mars now, the solo Beatles fan base, you know, you'll often get people extolling this album. I know John Heaton recently in his album ranking put it at #1. I think, yeah, it's, you know, it's not totally eclipsed and totally overshadowed, but I think it is to an extent. Yeah, this one sprung to mind as well. Pink Floyd, Saucerful of Secrets, which I think was always going to be overshadowed by the original first album, Piper at the Gates of Dawn, because that album was largely written by Syd Barrett. It was the debut album, and Syd's songs played a huge part, I suppose, in the original appeal of Pink Floyd. You know, the very quirky Pixies and Elf type songs mixed in with the more kind of out there astral plane type material, and even the non-Syd stuff is pretty far out. You know, things like Interstellar Overdrive, which does start with a Syd Barrett riff, but I think it's credited to all of them. You know, and I think he was still kind of on the edges of the scene when they made this album. I think he contributed here and there, but the album was produced by Norman Smith, and I think at this point he was starting to, you know, maybe decide that the Floyd weren't really for him. He'd had terrible problems with working with Syd Barrett, so I think the producer Norman Smith actually probably had a better time making this album than he'd had with the Barrett incarnation. Floyd themselves do credit this album with having quite an important role in their catalogue, really, in terms of helping to, you know, begin the process which they had to go through of starting to reshape themselves in the absence of Syd. And it has some really key tracks on it, you know, things like Set the Controls for the Heart of the Sun, which is a beautiful spacey kind of track with all these vibraphones, absolutely brilliant. And the title track, A Saucerful of Secrets, on side 2, is a very architectural piece. It was one which they planned out, you know, with a pen and paper, and I think they did see that track as the beginning of you know, the start of the journey that they were going to go on in order to make Dark Side of the Moon. But in terms of Pink Floyd rankings, or, you know, the way people see these albums, this one definitely seems to stand in the shadow of the Piper at the Gates of Dawn. So there we go, an album I really like, actually. I think the production could be better. Okay, 3 more. This one is quite a good example really. ABC and Beauty Stab, obviously their first album, Lexicon of Love, was absolutely massive, deservedly so, one of the greatest 80s pop albums ever, produced by Trevor Horn, and it was just an absolute sugar rush concoction, cynical lyrics married to this day-glow sparkling pop production. For the second album, they kept the engineer which they'd had for the first album, but they decided to go more guitar-y and go into a more political direction. And the critics really hated it. The critics really didn't like this album. I'm not sure what the chart placings were, but it's an interesting record. It's got some good songs on it. The best track is probably SOS, which maybe sounds most like a Trevor Horn production, maybe sounds most like it could have come from Lexicon of Love. But there are some other interesting songs on this album, and it is one I go back to. John Bellamy sent me this a few years ago, and I was actually quite surprised because I'd seen it in charity shops before, and it's just that classic thing of going, oh, you know, ABC. Well, you know, I've got Lexicon of Love. I don't really need to get Beauty Stab. So really, that makes it exactly what I'm talking about. You know, the Overshadowed album, but more guitar-y, squally guitar in places, but it's not a trillion miles away from Lexicon of Love, but the material on the whole is probably less memorable, and because I think critically it wasn't a very well highly regarded album, and I think, you know, to this day it stands in the shadow of Lexicon of Love. Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers, Into the Great Wide Open, the album that he made after Full Moon Fever, which had been an absolute monster success. That was his first solo album, and everybody loved it. I loved it. I think most of the record industry loved it. Everybody was knocked out by it. And so what he did was, because that album had been a complete solo effort really, working with Jeff Lynne, and Mike Campbell was on it. There were a couple of other guys on it, but it was not a Heartbreakers album. So the idea for this one was to go back into the studio with the Heartbreakers and try the Jeff Lynne production again. This time Jeff Lynne went more overboard with his production, and I think it's a great album. It's one I've always loved. I would rather listen to Learning to Fly now than Free Falling. In fact, that was always the case. The first time I heard Learning to Fly, I thought, yeah, that's a better song than Free Falling. It's more, or it's less obvious. It's just got a beautiful sound, and there's some great stuff on this record, but it's always going to be overshadowed by Full Moon Fever. Full Moon Fever was the big Tom Petty album. This one was the sequel. I don't think Tom Petty rated it as highly as Full Moon Fever, and the band certainly did not enjoy working with Jeff Lynne on this record. They found his approach too stifling really, and I don't think they look at it very fondly at all. Having said that, they didn't look at Full Moon Fever very fondly at all either, because they'd been left off it. So the final one, staying with Tom Petty, the second Travelling Wilburys album was always going to be overshadowed by the first one, mainly because of the absence of Roy Orbison, who had passed away in between. The first album was a bit of a fluke, just again a bit like Tubular Bells, a happy accident, just a coming together of friends, and they just made this album, and it was just a huge, massive success. Then Roy passed away, and then there was a big long delay then, because I think Tom, Bob Dylan and maybe Jeff Lynne were all working on other projects or doing other things, and George had to wait for them to get free of all their various commitments. And when they came to make the album, they had to make it in a rush because Bob Dylan was due to go out on the road again. So what they did was they just recorded it really quickly, and they had Bob Dylan record, I think, virtually all the lead vocals for every track, because they wanted just to get his contributions down. And the idea later on then was to replace some of his vocals, which they did do, but they left Bob singing the lion's share of the songs on this album, and I think that made it a less satisfying album, I think, for people who were maybe not big on Bob Dylan but like the Travelling Wilburys. You know, the first Wilburys album, Bob's got two lead vocals. He sings on Congratulations and Tweeter and the Monkey Man. On this one he sings on, you know, over half the album, maybe 3/4 of the album. Plus, of course, you don't have Roy Orbison, and I think the Wilburys themselves realised after making this album that, you know, without Roy, is it the Wilburys really? Definitely misses his voice, misses that great operatic quality he brought. So the first Wilburys album will always overshadow the second one, I think. Right, so there we go. Those are my suggestions. Be glad to know if you have any others. I can think of a few others, but I didn't want the video to be too long. So there we go. Hope you enjoyed it, and thanks for watching. I'll be back soon. Take care. Bye for now.